So let's take a look at some new datasheets and new detachments for the Adeptus Astartes. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking new rules for the Space Marines, these ones for the new chapter-specific detachments, and the rather interesting datasheets for Games Workshop's new models for them, themed captains for 2 of the major chapters. So far for Games Workshop's Core Codex chapter expansions, we've had datasheets for 3 previous characters, one for Salamanders, Imperial Fists, and Raven Guard. So now we were just waiting on the last 2 of the first wave, the Suboden Khan of the White Scars and Caanok Var of the Iron Hands. And it seems that as with the rest, they've got a unique version of one of the Core Codex Space Marine detachments. Only their chapter can play it. The rules are overall more buffs than nerfs, and also if you play that new character in the detachment, then you happen to get an additional special rule for them leading it. I guess with a new wave of Ultramarines on the way, we're going to get a similar thing but more. 3 new datasheets and maybe a unique version of Gladius for all we know at this point. In any case, it seems that this Space Marine rules drop is going to give us Suboden Khan's datasheets for the White Scars, Caanok Var's datasheets for the Iron Hands, so pretty interesting to see what some new and powerful characters can offer. And then for the detachments, as you guessed, the White Scars get a Spearpoint Task Force, which is an altered version of the Storm Lance, so the White Scars themed one, all about fast attack and bikes. Though the Iron Hands is a bit of a curveball, like the Imperial Fist, it seems they've got a First Company Terminator and Dreadnought style detachment. This one's called the Hammer of Avernii, so it seems they chose not to give them a twist on Ironstorm, though I suppose Anvil could have been another choice for them. At the moment, these rules aren't officially out yet, and Games Workshop seems to have done the thing again. They've given their certain approved content creators copies of the documents, and then they've shared them to the internet, so basically people do know the rules, but only sort of second hand. And it seems that these content creators aren't allowed to just post full pictures of what they've got. Having to transcribe datasheets and stratagems means that we basically know the full rules for these things, though there might be a few subtleties that aren't obvious until the datasheets are out themselves. I've tried to parse them as best I can. In any case, for the actual information being relayed, credits to people like Goonhammer and the Art of War for posting those over on their sites. The official rules for the rest of Warhammer players to see will likely turn up on their page to download in the not too distant future. I'd guess they'll update the Space Marine faction pack maybe on one of the Wednesdays as they often seem to. I'd guess it'd either be this week or next week, could be either. In any case though, regardless of them being out, the rules are basically fully out at this point. So let's start with the Iron Hands, talking about Caanok Var and their new detachment. It seems that Caanok Var is apparently 100 points, so a big chunky and fairly costly Terminator character there. That's more than all the generic ones in the Codex, but not really by all that much. The Terminator Captain's 95, and he's got a fairly standard Terminator Captain stat line. Movement 5, Toughness 5 with 6 wounds, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invulnerable save. Leadership 6 and OC 1, though in reality he's far tankier than the standard Terminator Captain. He gets a 5+ feel no pain, so he's going to be genuinely quite a prospect to take down. He'll have 2 slogs through 9 wounds worth of Terminator profile on average. It means it's not out of the question he could just be fielded completely solo and just lay low. If for some reason in some detachment he should help out an army in a big way. As he's a Terminator, he can deep strike, and as a leader he can join either Terminators or the Terminator Assault Squad and give them a fairly nice damage buff. The lore behind this guy is that he's the leader of Clan Avernii, the most heavily augmented Iron Hands company, as seen in a similar sort of light to the first company of other chapters. He's absolutely capable of wading through enemies, though he's probably more well known for his command abilities, with a logic engine built into his Terminator armour and some fun servo skulls and sensors constantly gathering battlefield data. As a result, his melee profile maybe isn't absolutely overwhelming, but it's not worse than the other Terminator characters. He has a standard issue Stormbolter that can lay low a few light infantry, I guess, and then that big power Tetsubo thing is called Axiom. Its strike mode is basically like a power fist that hits on a 2+, the same as the Terminator Captain's one. 5 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2. And then if he's against 1 wound infantry, he's got a sweep mode that's going to be more efficient, again hitting on a 2+, 10 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. Maybe a little bit unusual to get a strike and sweep on what's essentially a power maul. Then for his special rules, he's got 2 pretty solid ones on his datasheet, and he gets a further one if you run him in his themed Iron Hands detachment as mentioned. First up, he gets a particularly useful damage buff called Cold and Calculating. This model's unit gets lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, and sustained hits worn against all other targets, and that's both at range and at melee. And overall, it's just a really solid, useful buff. It means that you always get the best of both worlds. Lieutenants are genuinely very handy for giving lethal hits to punch up against tough stuff, but that doesn't really matter quite so much against things that already be wounding on a 3 or better. But nice enough that you're never going to drop below a certain percentage of damage increase due to sustained hits, and usually that'll just mean the squad almost always gets the one that they'd really want. I guess you might want lethal hits on some Stormbolters against certain tougher infantry targets, but still getting sustained on them isn't the end of the world. Overall, that feels successful enough at making a Terminator squad significantly more dangerous. Then otherwise for his second buffing rule, he's got his Cerebrex Logic Engine, and this one's a two-part thing that gives you two quite nice command abilities that is nice to have. In the Declare Battlefield Formation step, you get to choose one Adeptus Astartes infantry unit in your army to gain the Scout 6 inches rule. That's a pretty unusual one to be able to hand out, and just really nice that it doesn't necessarily have to be on his unit as well. You could choose something completely different if you wanted something else skirmishing. Space Marines do have quite a few good choices for that. You could put it on Blade Guard or Eradicators if it made sense. Maybe get some Intercessors into the midboard to hopefully get their sticky objectives working as soon as possible. Or you could just use it on his unit himself and then have a Terminator squad stomping up to the midboard, maybe screened out by some scouts so the opponent doesn't hem them back. I think that should already be pretty good, but on top of that he also gets a single unit redeploy as well. At the end of deploying armies, but before you know who gets first turn, you get to choose one unit and either redeploy it elsewhere or put it off the table. Again, a really nice ability, at least just to have one copy of. It can be good with infiltrator units, maybe denying enemy infiltrators a place to drop and then taking them back. It could be nice for nosing a tank out of line of sight and making sure that the first engagement is in your favour. Or just trying to wrong foot the opponent by putting down something unexpected. Maybe they counter deploy and then you just take that unit off the board. You could even combine it with a scout move thing, I guess, redeploy the unit and then scout up on an unexpected angle. Overall, between all that, I feel like he's pretty excellent value for 100 points. He's tougher than most Terminator characters, has a captain style melee profile, which is fine. The damage buff is a legitimately powerful one for Terminator units. In particular, the lethal hits will help out power fists actually be more meaningful against very tough stuff. And then I feel like both of those special rules with the logic engine have some genuinely good value that's worth points in their own right. And between all that, I think you've got a very efficient character on your hands. Probably his biggest issue is the overall cost and efficiency of Terminator data sheets for Core Codex Space Marines in 40k, though it's certainly possible that that could change in a future balance update. As mentioned though, he's absolutely pivotal to the strength of the Enhanced detachment, to the point where you basically wouldn't want to run it if he wasn't on the board. Before we get into that one though, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor Lighter Creative, a wargame supplies company who wanted to share their Battlefield gaming mats and pre-painted terrain sets. For their battle mats, they've got a take on the standard playing surface for Warhammer 40k games, this rather scorched and blasted battlefield being their standard one. The right size for playing 2000 points 40k, made out of synthetic leather, somewhat waterproof, and aimed to speed up some gameplay with the deployment zones all marked out on it, so you know where to set up. They've recently made an improved version of this one, which I think is just out in the USA at the moment. That's a bit thicker with an anti-slip bottom, though it also seems that they have cheaper ones on their own website. For the more standard issue version, they've got several different designs. I quite like the Adamant Bastion one that they have as well. And they do have some smaller ones as well, aimed at kill team or combat patrol. Otherwise, they've also got their terrain set as well, this one called their Ashfall Citadel. They sent me a set of this one and I was quite impressed with it. It's basically made of die-cut wood that's already pre-painted, pretty fast to put together and looks fairly fun and grungy on the tabletop. I feel like it does rather well for being one of the cheaper tabletop terrain sets that can do a whole board of 40k, £120 or $160 currently, and that's enough for a whole battlefield. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. You can check them out, links down in the video description. Let's get on to a new detachment though, and next up we have the Hammer of Avernii. That's the Iron Hands detachment, and as mentioned, rather than being a different twist on Space Marine Ironstorm, they've decided to make it another take on the first company detachment, kind of similar to what the Imperial Fist got. I guess because their unique release character is a Terminator-clad one. This one has a fair few similarities that make some changes, including a much bigger emphasis on dreadnoughts. The detachment rule is changed from the first company. That's the one that just once per game gives you 4 rerolls to wound against the Oath of Moment targets, but this one goes similar to the Imperial Fist take on it, where you just get 2 reroll wound rolls of 1 against the Oath of Moment target every turn. I'd say that probably is more useful overall. It does give you yet another direct damage boost against your detachment targets, though it is already one that you're going to be wounding quite well. You'd be already fully rerolling to hit and plus 1 to wound, so adding an extra reroll 1 to wound on that isn't unhelpful, but does double down on a target that you're probably already going to kill quite well. It's not going to be very impactful if you're fighting against a lightly armoured guerrilla warfare sort of force where you're already likely to kill the things that you shoot at anyway. In reality though, the really good thing about the detachment is that if Caanok Var is on the battlefield, then you can redesignate the Oath of Moment target once per battle round when your target is destroyed. So basically Caanok Var can function like mini Guilliman while he's on the tabletop. And given that he's an 100-point model and your Oath of Moment is even more boosted compared with other Space Marine detachments out there, that's really no small thing indeed. His buff for redesignated is technically even more powerful than Guilliman's as well, as Guilliman has to pick one then the other, both in the command phase, whereas he can choose after you've already seen how the turn's unfolding, so maybe doesn't need quite as much clever thinking ahead, and getting those inbuilt reroll ones to wound against the target means that you've just got that extra small boost as to killing the squad. Overall, I feel like that's a pretty meaningful buff really. It just might give you you a little bit of a trade-off as to whether or not you really want to get Caanok Var stuck into combat super early with Terminators, as ideally you'd really want him just surviving at least a few rounds of the game to make maximal use of that. In any case, regardless of veteran things, it means that sort of any Space Marine firebase or standard unit skirmishing are likely to have super hyped up damage in this detachment. Next up, let's look through the stratagems. I'll compare these to the version of the first company that we already have. Some are exactly the same, some are buffed slightly, there's one that's swapped out, and some add some extra targets. The one that's gone is the Battle Shock one in the fight phase, which I don't think will be missed quite so much. And as with most Space Marine attachments, you still have Armour of Contempt, worsening AP by 1 when your unit's selected as a target of an attack. Generally handy to have, particularly on things like Terminators and Dreadnoughts. Besides that though, most of the other stratagems are ones that you must target to veteran units, so basically Terminator units, Stern Guard, Vanguard or Blade Guard veterans. Though given its Iron Hands, they've also added Dreadnoughts to the list here, which is really quite big and meaningful as they can actually shoot quite hard and tend to be nice powerful damage dealers. 3 of them can now be used on Dreadnoughts. There's one that still just works for the veterans and one that's Terminator only. Cogitative Ferocity does work for the Dreads though, and this one's a new one, giving you a nice simple either sustained or lethal hits in the fight phase, so a simple extra damage buff there, hard to go too far wrong with. Terminators or Blade Guard veterans would enjoy that well enough. Feel like it's a bit limited application on Dreadnoughts, though not nothing. Lethal hits is usually handy to be able to flex into to take down tough stuff. The sustained hits will stack excellently with the boosted Oath of Moment that they get, so it might be popular to use for absolutely maximal damage when you're trying to destroy an Oath target. Ruthless Butchery is 1 command point, +1 to hit when shooting and fighting, and also a +1 to wound if your unit is below starting strength. This one's similar to a First Company Task Force one, but it's buffed. You now get the +1 to wound below starting strength, not just half strength. I feel like with Dreadnoughts as an option for this one, there's going to be pretty good chances where you can convert this to +1 to hit and wound. Things like Redemptors or Ballistas Dreadnoughts seem like they're pretty likely to be able to be damaged but not outright destroyed. The same with Terminator squads too. Again, this seems like an absolutely great way of handing out just massive damage into the opponent. That might be best aimed at something that isn't one of your boosted Oath targets, given that there's a bit of overlap and anti-synergy there. Then the other 3 are all more or less unchanged from First Company Task Force. Legendary Fortitude is only used on the veteran units, but not the Dreadnoughts. That's -1 damage for 1 command point when you get charged. It's pretty good for Blade Guard or Terminators getting attacked by damage 2 or damage 3 weapons. A bit niche and opponent dependent though, it's not going to help you against shooting attacks. For 1 command point, there's Dropship Extraction. It's only Terminators that can use that, and that's a return to reserve at the end of the enemy fight phase if they're outside of engagement range. It could be handy enough late game for Terminators to keep up the pressure and make sure they're close to the enemy. Maybe going after a home objective if they're out of position and aren't in a position to threaten something else. Or could be used super early game if you really wanted to. Plonking a Terminator unit in the mid-board and giving them a chance for a 9-inch charge, even if it's not odds on to succeed. It does feel interesting, but you do have to use it on generally quite expensive units, and it's not actually a reliable way to get them into melee. So it feels like it's more of an option than a huge source of strength. It's also not really helped by Terminator datasheets being a bit on the costly side for what they do currently. Finally, for 1 command point, there's the Dominator Beacon, and this one's the sticky objective one, and you use it in the movement phase. You don't have to use it in the command phase, so that's better than several alternatives to this, as it means that you can move up onto an objective, and then once you've taken it, mark it, so it just gives you a bit more flexibility. As with the others though, it is locked to the Veteran or Dreadnought datasheets, so you can't do it with small skirmishing Space Marine utility units, which definitely is a downside. Then we've got enhancements, 2 of them unchanged, 2 of them altered, and they have had 1 of them outright replaced, losing the 5+ Feel No Pain one that gives the character that, and then an entire Terminator squad that for 1 phase. Maybe a bit of a shame seeing as that's a good one, though the one that it's subbed out for is also nice. For the first 2, these 2 have just been renamed. Spiritus Ferrum gives you +1 attack to the bearer's melee weapons, and a once per game +1 attack to the entire squad's melee weapons. That's 25 points in First Company, and that seems like a fairly easy one to get value out of in a Terminator or Blade Guard squad. Then there's Medusan Roar, which is a renamed version of a First Company one once again. This one's the one where if enemies fail battle shock within 6 inches of the bearer, immediately 1 model is destroyed, and then once per game you can increase that to D3 models. That's always been quite a fun one, as there's actually the potential to lose some actually genuinely valuable stuff there, but given its battle shock it's always going to be very hit and miss, and not necessarily guaranteed they're even going to need to test in the first place, unless you take some specific battle shock units. Maybe could combo with Reavers or Infernus Marines or Whirlwinds or something if you wanted to. Then we've got the 2 ones that were changed. The Iron Laurel is a slightly buffed one of the First Company version. It gives you +1 objective control for the bearer, and then +1 OC for any other models in the bearer's unit, and that's declared once per game at the start of FAs. Previously that was locked to Terminators only, now it can be for anyone, so I guess slightly improved there. If it remains the 10 points it was in First Company Task Force, that's still pretty reasonable. Probably more of a points filler than a game changer, but that's genuinely not unhelpful to have on something like a Blade Guard or Terminator squad scrapping for the mid-board. They might wind up on objectives, and you can basically just look at the start of the command phase as to whether or not that's actually going to tip the balance between your objectives or the opponent. Every so often, it might just allow you to ping it into being extra victory points. And then finally we have Steel Font. This one is Terminator only, and while leading a unit you can basically heal one Terminator in your command phase, so acting a little bit like an apothecary but for Terminators, and that's pretty powerful with restoring some good points onto the board, and potentially if they're remaining on the board and wanting to make a shorter charge, you could put them at the front of the unit so they reduce the charge distance. That could be quite impactful with the distance that you can put them in coherency and the width of the model's base. Probably seems particularly nice on the Terminator Assault Squad, which is going to be more likely than most to survive enemy damage with 4 wounds. It seems that we don't know the points cost for any of these yet, and it means that these could be expensive if they wanted them to be. Overall, for first thoughts on these guys, Caanok Var seems to be a pretty efficient character for 100 points at first impressions. His damage buff is a good one, the scout rule is a useful one, the redeploy rule is useful too, and he does contribute with his own melee while being an unusually tanky Terminator character as well. Overall, for his individual datasheet, he seems very solid indeed, and obviously going up to be absolutely auto-include and kind of ridiculous value in the Avernii detachment versus not having him, but I feel like that's more sort of balanced around the idea that he is in the army to begin with. Overall, I feel like his individual datasheet is super strong. Perhaps the biggest issues are the context. Terminator still being considered a bit mid isn't exactly going to help him out. If they suddenly became some of the best damage dealers for Codex Space Marines, then he's going to be a lot more relevant. And otherwise, to play Iron Hands and unlock him in the first place, you've only got his datasheet. I'm Father Fyros, who is maybe one of the slightly more middling characters out of the Space Marine arsenal. And the Avernii First Company detachment, which definitely has more interest than First Company Task Force, but on the same time it is built against a detachment that's otherwise considered pretty weak. Talking of which, the Avernii detachment is still interesting, I think. It does seem like a flatly improved version of First Company to me. Being able to redesignate the Oath of Moment like that is such a big deal. Ultramarines can do similar, but only if you include a 340 point model, and having Caanok Var around, who seems fairly efficient in his own right otherwise, just means that you've got a lot more points to put other damage dealers on the board and still have some absolutely massive hard-hitting damage against 2 of the enemy units if you can kill the first. I feel like that core rule is the single biggest selling point, as that helps out everything and not just veterans. You can make some pretty scary hard-hitting tank gun lines with this, but for stratagem support for the Terminators and Dreadnoughts, that does seem reasonable enough. There's some okay damage dealers and a couple of helpful defensive ones, and for the enhancements I rate most of them as okay. Basically, this one does have some pretty serious damage threats, but very little support in actually delivering the damage to that target, unlike Gladius with its advance and charge and advance and shoot style rules. And between the overall offering, while Terminators stay the points cost that they are, I feel like this one's probably still not going to be one of the very strongest ways to play Space Marines, at least at a top tier competitive level. For more casual games, just the sheer amount of damage output that you can put out with Iron Hands gun lines here might outweigh that, and then have a few veteran units to support and skirmish and use the stratagems, probably with a solid amount of Dreadnoughts to be able to threaten to use the +1 to hit and wound stratagem, which is pretty brutal if they get slightly damaged but not outright killed. Perhaps a bunch of Redemptors, Var with some Assault Terminators and some Blade Guard to fight for the midboard, plus the usual Space Marine supporting units. This also seems like it could be one of the better ones for indirect fire as well. A battery of Whirlwinds feels like an even more fearsome prospect, with an improved Oath of Moment that you can then redesignate. Let's get on to the second half of the Space Marine updates though, and talk about Suboden Khan and the White Scars. It seems that the new jetbike character for the White Scars is 115 points. He is the captain of the First Company equivalent, the Spearpoint Brotherhood, and often leads the chapter in his chapter master's stead when on the battlefield. Well, at points cost and being on a mounted Space Marine bike, he has a big 8 wounds, has the same toughness 5 as Outriders and a 4+ invulnerable save for being a captain. He's got leadership 6 and an OC 2 and has a big 12-inch move. I'm genuinely not sure whether or not he'll have the fly keyword. I guess he probably might due to being a jet bike, but then I suppose things like the Impulsor don't have it. I didn't see anyone mention it on their reviews unless I missed. Feel free to let me know down in the comment section, or I guess we'll find out when the datasheets go live. And otherwise, as you guess, he's a leader unit who can join Outriders, who confer +1 damage on the charge to their entire unit, so the Outriders will buff him in a pretty meaningful way to have him hitting extra hard on the charge. They also get +1 strength as well, though the damage feels like the really meaningful bit. For his weapons, he gets an Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and we know the profiles for those. 8 attacks, hitting on a 2+ at Strength 5, AP 0, Damage 1 with Dev Wounds. Not bad for streaming out a few hordes, and the Mortal Wounds might help a bit against tougher stuff if you get lucky. He's also got a Bolt Pistol, which you might occasionally want to fire if he's locked in a protracted melee. If it's fielded in the White Scars detachment though, I guess he's going to be falling back and charging more often. For his melee gear, he gets Stormtooth, which is a 6 attacks, Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2 power weapon essentially, but with some pretty nice keywords. As you guess, he gets the Lance keyword, so that's a +1 to wound on the charge, and he also has anti-monster and anti-vehicle. Most of the time, if he's charging in an Outrider squad, that's not really going to be very relevant. He'll be wounding everything in the game pretty much on a 4+ anyway, besides the very toughest stuff out there like Titans. But it would make a difference in a protracted melee where he gets countercharged or he can't fall back or something. Otherwise, again, he's got a sweep profile as well, which I guess will be pretty rarely used. 8 attacks with a strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 power sword, which doesn't really get all that many attacks, but against certain targets it will actually be the preferred option. If he's in a protracted melee and it's damage 1, then it's going to be just things like toughness 4, 1 wound infantry, but if he's on the charge with Outriders, then that's going to be damage 2 attacks, and he just very fractionally outperforms the Lance against things like standard intercessors or Chaos Legionaries, more so if you have boosted Oath of Moment on the go too, I suppose. In any case though, the Lance one feels like the one to focus on. 6 attacks at strength 7 and damage 3 on the charge with the Outrider buff is pretty punchy. It's going to make big impacts both against really tough stuff and very nice against Terminator equivalents, hitting and wounding them on a 2+ with attacks that will insta-kill them if they fail their invulnerable saves. Then finally we've got his special rules, and both of them basically help his squad get into melee from a super long way away. Spear of Chigoris means that his unit can shoot and charge after either advancing or falling back, so that means that he's got a pretty enormous threat range with Outriders just to start with, so say fairly reliably moving around about 15 inches and still being able to put down a bunch of light infantry and charge into something after that. So a pretty big impact there. Quite a nice feels good one, as it means he'll actually be able to be using that Onslaught Gatling cannon with advance and charge. And then this one's got a weird sort of extra bit where you get +1 to advance and charge if you have rules that confer both of these abilities to him already. That's a bit of a weird one, as there's very few things in Space Marine detachments that give you both of those rules at once. He could get it via the Spearpoint Brotherhood and using one of the 1 command point stratagems on his squad, which I guess could be a weird way to make that stratagem into essentially a +2 inches to your threat range if you think that's going to be critical. Then finally, as if he weren't able to get into his target quite well enough, this model's unit can also move through terrain features in both the movement and the charge phase. That feels like a bit of an unusual one for mounted units, as they are generally hampered by terrain a bit more than jump units or infantry, having to go around ruins to get into close combat as opposed to smashing directly through. The existence of this one basically means that you can put him in the ground floor of a ruin, just completely safe from line of sight, and then zip out with that enormous movement distance of 15 inches and charge the enemy, potentially even going through terrain if it makes sense to on the way into close quarters. In reality, with the big bases of this guy and Outriders, you might still struggle to use this all that meaningfully in the charge phase, but it certainly doesn't hurt and might allow another squad member to get in. Overall, between all that, you've basically got a guy who's just going to move super fast from safety, almost certainly hit the enemy first after shooting a bunch of stuff first, and then basically does enough to make the Outriders into a more general purpose threat. He's going to be absolutely great at taking down tough stuff or Terminator equivalents, whereas the Outriders themselves can chip in with a bunch of damage 2 attacks on the charge, hurting more medium infantry or lighter stuff. Then for his themed detachment, this one's the White Scars Spearpoint Task Force. This one's an altered version of the Stormlance Task Force, a slightly lesser played detachment, but does okay to support marine melee. A lot of its synergies either work with Space Marine vehicles with fly or mounted units, and that makes it very limited to things like Storm Speeders and Outriders, which aren't awful but also don't carry a list. On the more competitive scene though, just the reactive move and the advance and charge army-wide is enough to sell it and have it genuinely win tournaments for things like Ultramarines, Dark Angels or maybe Space Wolves. Ultramarines quite enjoy the reactive moves with skirmish infantry, Dark Angels like advance and charge on slow moving elites, and they've got some bikes, and Space Wolves have the Thunder Wolves too. Basically getting an improved version of this one is not a bad thing, though all the biker related stuff would be a lot more interesting if Space Marines had a more generic hard hitting melee bike unit, as Outriders just mainly do light infantry. In any case, this version of it can only be played for White Scars, and the core rule is unchanged, giving you advance and charge and fall back and charge to your entire Space Marine army. That bit's not locked to mounted things, and that's just a general really big boost any sort of Space Marine melee, whether it's Outriders, Jump Intercessors, Vanguard Veterans, Blade Guard, or anything else. Then for the boosted rule for Suboden Khan, this one's Wrath of the First Khan. It's not quite as crazy pivotal as the Iron Hands one, but it is quite nice to get Suboden Khan potentially safe after killing something. At the end of the fight phase, if Suboden Khan's unit destroyed an enemy unit this fight phase, it's not now in engagement range, it gets to make a normal move of 6 inches, so you could basically have that super fast bite squad strike out, maybe hit something that was something like 22 inches away, kill that unit, and then get to make a 6-inch normal move, potentially trying to either get to an objective or contesting one, or just keeping the unit safe behind terrain if they hit something outlying. The detachment does have a nice reactive move stratagem as well, which could be yet another way to gain more movement, so you could basically have this unit move 12 inches before the enemy gets to attack them, which is quite a big deal. For the stratagems, the one that they lost is the 2 command point one for the automatic 6-inch advance or the automatic 9-inch advance for the mounted units. That one could genuinely be a very big deal, as it basically meant that you could almost guarantee that certain units made charges exactly when they needed to. Though with 2 command points, it did mean that you burnt opportunities to use command points on other good things elsewhere. I feel like losing it isn't the end of the world. The units in this detachment are still going to have very good threat ranges. As for the Iron Hands, they also have Armour of Contempt, always solidly handy to have, and as per the balance data slate, only it works against one unit now. They've still got the 6-inch reactive move, that one's unchanged. Hunter's Instincts gives you a reactive move of 6 inches if an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches, and it applies to your infantry and mounted units. They did errated that for core Codex Space Marines to say that you can't use it on Guilliman, basically. This one's a super powerful one, basically literally wherever it crops up in 40k. The enemy moves up to a unit that just destroyed something, your unit then hides behind terrain or backs away from a charge and maybe lives where otherwise might have died. It's really pretty great. With his special rule ghosting through terrain, Suboden Khan's unit is going to be more useful with this one, compared with other Outriders perhaps. For 1 command point, there's Evasive Maneuvers. This one means a mounted or fly vehicle unit gets -1 to hit and wound in the shooting phase. A surprisingly powerful reactive defensive stratagem. Even stuff that isn't necessarily all that tough gets really quite hard to kill with that on the go. Could be nice on a valuable Outrider unit like Suboden Khan, or just a skirmish one that's trying to survive on an objective this turn. Several people have made it work with Storm Ravens with their -1 damage as well, making them weirdly tanky. And it could even be useful enough on Storm Speeders, which rather than being very fragile, then become genuinely fairly tanky if you have this on the go and you can only shoot them and not charge them. Then we've got the 3 ones that changed a bit more. Mobile Lethality gives you advance and shoot and fallback and shoot, both of which are generally great rules to have in a Space Marine army full stop. It might mean that tanks and vehicles can get lines of sight on an enemy they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, or not compromise between getting onto an objective and still shooting. It gives insurance against the enemy locking up your most powerful range damage dealers, and you might well have some given the existence of one enhancement here. As mentioned, Suboden Khan could use this one specifically for a +1 to advance and charge if you just need that little bit of extra threat range on him. This one's changed previously. Previously, if you had the assault keyword already, it could give you sustained hits 1, but the stratagem didn't have the fallback and shoot option, which is a pretty significant one to gain. Then for 1 command point, we've got Spear Thrust and Saber Swing. Your unit gains either lance or lethal hits, or both if it's a mounted unit. As the name would suggest, it only works in the fight phase. This one's changed a bit and has again become better. Previously it was lance for mounted units and reroll charges, which I guess occasionally could have been an overall positive, but on the other hand it meant that you had to commit to the stratagem before you'd even known that you'd made your charge successfully, which did make it just a little bit more clunky and iffy in my opinion. Overall feels like this one's more useful, not least because it can be used on all your other melee units that aren't just mounted ones, so Blade Guard veterans will be enjoying either of those, or maybe Captains or Kossaro Khan alongside Stern Guard or Assault Intercessors charging in. I quite like the way that it doubles down on Outriders, means that a unit of them charging in with their AP1 and damage 2 attacks are genuinely far more threatening against tough stuff. I guess for Suboden Khan it doesn't hurt as well, though I guess it won't help him out quite as much on some, as he already has Lance on one of his profiles. Then finally for 1 CP we've got Withdraw and Regroup. Mounted or fly vehicle units that aren't within engagement range gets 2 return 2 strategic reserves. Again, pretty much always useful when this one turns up. That's a pretty good ability and means that you could have Outriders jumping around the board late game to do utility things, or I guess potentially things like Storm Speeders too. I feel like if you didn't already have incentive to maximise the amount of Outriders in the army, this one gives you another good one. At the very least, even if you don't go for bigger blockier units, then having sets of 3 of them will be a good idea, plus whatever unit Suboden Khan is leading. You could also use this on Invader ATVs as well. They could be another option for doing utility things, jumping around the board with this. Then we've got the enhancements. It seems that as with the Iron Hands, 2 are the same and 2 are slightly changed. First up there's Spearpoint Paragon. This one gives you +1 strength and +1 AP on your melee weapons, and then boosted to +2 of each if you charged. The change with this one is that it no longer requires your character to be a mounted character, so it means that you can put it on things other than the Chaplain on bike if you want to. It is a pretty reasonable enhancement for the Chaplain on bike if you want to use one, but quite nice to have other options out there. Powerfist captains will enjoy being strength 10 and potentially AP 4 on the charge. That is quite a good buff. Though I feel like if it does remain 25 points like in Stormlance, it feels more borderline than auto-include. Next up there's Storm Spear's Wisdom. This one's renamed but unchanged. While leading a unit you get to reroll advances. That's definitely not awful and adds a little reliability, particularly in this detachment where you're often going to be advancing and charging. If it stays 15 points like it is in the Codex, then I feel like it's merely okay once again. Not bad, but maybe more of a points filler than something that you absolutely want in your army. The next one's Hunter's Eye, which makes a reappearance from previous White Scars codexes as a relic. This version of it just seems just as good if not better though, being a surprisingly serious range buff, giving models in your unit ignore cover and sustained hits 1. That only applies to ranged weapons. It replaces the slightly lesser taken fall back and shoot enhancement in the Stormlance. Overall that one seems absolutely great to me, maybe particularly for something like a unit of Hellblasters or perhaps Eradicators, and maybe more so if you're leading them by a Lieutenant. That means you have lethal hits and sustained hits on 6s, and with Oath of Moment you could be rerolling everything to hit if you wanted and fishing for them. And probably doesn't hurt as well that this attachment just gained a fall back and shoot stratagem, so your elite infantry is going to be able to keep firing. Feels to me like maybe a big unit of Hellblasters jumping out of a repulsor really wouldn't be the worst move in this detachment. Adding in a Lieutenant to make them hit harder, they could be deleting multiple units per turn, and particularly with boosted Oath on the go with a +1 to wound as well. Then finally we've got Chigorian Huntmaster. This one allows mounted models to arrive from strategic reserves as if it were one battle round earlier, the same as the Hunter's Instincts one. There's often been really quite a popular one for the Space Wolves in particular. The reason it's so good is that it allows you to rapid ingress turn 1 unlike multiple similar options for some reason. So essentially for one command point you can set up a big scary bike unit and then have it all ready to charge in your next turn, absolutely guaranteed given their good movement. I say it is useful here, but does mean that you would have to build around a bike chaplain plus outriders, and for that to be overall worth it. It's definitely not an awful unit and makes good use of other stratagems in this detachment, but at the same time they're not quite as good mainline damage dealers as other things out there in 40k. The enhancement's better for things like Space Wolf Thunderwolves or Raven Guard Vanguard veterans with their own unique detachments version of it over there. Overall, for first impressions out of those two, Suboden Khan looks pretty solid and scary. He does cost a lot of points, but I feel like just having the sheer luxury of being able to charge that far from behind terrain and hit quite that hard is quite a fun thing. I feel like his detachment buff also helps out a bit too with the kill something and then back off or hide. Depending on quite how bold he's being, it's not necessarily going to save him, but if you can hit something that's a bit more isolated, it might genuinely make him just hard to kill in return, and then maybe he can do it all over again. Otherwise, for the White Scars attachment, it definitely looks interesting. It is basically a flat improved version of the Space Marine Stormlance, again the trade-off being that it's locked to White Scars units, whose biggest downside is they don't have a really hard-hitting biker unit, where what they probably want is some sort of veteran Primaris bikers with power weapons of some description. It is interesting though, they can field one threatening bike unit with Suboden himself. He gets that bonus reactive move in this one, plus some decent stratagem support. It's just beyond that, you have the slightly more middling threat of a Chaplain plus Outriders as the mounted option, and then otherwise having a few stratagems locked out, and maybe more using it to support generic Space Marine melee, things like Jump Intercessors, or perhaps Blade Guard or Vanguard veterans. As mentioned though, I'd still probably be tempted to max the Outriders just with good stratagem support and the option to jump around the board late game if they need to. For the actual improvements versus Stormlance, it seems like there's a few fairly big wins. Having the ranged enhancement is surprisingly strong here. I feel like you now would want to make room for a solid ranged infantry threat, as you're getting ignore cover and sustained hits every turn, which is very, very good. The melee damage stratagem being buffed for bikers and being usable on non-biker things is also a really big win. It's just nice to be able to support Blade Guard on things, and the fallback and shoot is handy enough. Adding those into an already good detachment with a 6-inch reactive move, advance and charge everywhere, and the -1 to hit and wound range debuff, which works well for some units, they've got quite a powerful army. It does at least seem interesting enough. I feel like it's just really lacking that one extra big hitting damage dealer unit, or I feel like in lieu of that it would have been nice to have the option to take more Outrider squads in this one. I feel like it's one of the ones where Games Workshop could have chosen not to lock it to 3 of them and make them battle line. In any case though, let me know what you make of the new White Scars and Iron Hands rules. I look forward to hearing your takes down in the comments below. I feel like Games Workshop's done a good enough job to make both of them interesting. I guess it's more likely that the White Scars detachment might have more success on the competitive scene, though I really wouldn't write off the big damage of the Iron Hands just to literally line up a bunch of tanks and dreadnoughts to delete things with 2 sets of even further buffed boosted Oath of Moment, and then use the veterans as some support. Will be interesting to see if we see much success with either of these on the tournament scene, and I look forward to reporting on some lists if any do well. As mentioned, a big thank you to Lighter Creative for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check out their Warzone terrain mats and a pre-painted wooden terrain set down in the video description if you are looking for some things to set up a 40k battlefield right now. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and keep the videos coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that link down in the video description. A big thank you to anyone helping out there. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, occasional votes to see what sort of things happen next on Auspex Tactics, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.